guys were sent. So let me go to here. And this PowerPoint presentation is already shared on that folder, so you can revisit it. So we're going to start off with some basic photography terms. Exposure. This one's fairly basic. We're all aware of it. It's the amount of light per unit area reaching a frame or photographic film or the surface of an electronic image or sensor. It is determined by the shutter speed, aperture, so the lens f number, ISO rating, as well as the amount of light that exists within the scene. Shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, those are known as like the exposure triangle. They're kind of all working together in order to get an image that's properly exposed, has the right amount of darks, midtones, and bright values. So you can see clearly with the painting, underexposed, properly exposed, and overexposed. Now, when it comes to using like our phone, for the most part, this is going to be set to kind of an auto exposure. So you're not going to necessarily have to be hyper aware of all of those different parameters. However, the more control that you have, likely you can get better documentation of your work. So it's still good for us to be aware of these terms. So shutter speed refers to how quickly the camera shutter opens and closes. Consequently, the shutter speed also determines the duration and amount of light that interacts with the light-sensitive film or sensor. So, I had the benefit, or have the benefit, that my wife's a professional photographer. So that's how I've acquired some of this gear over the years. So she had a really nice lens, and in our backyard there was a fox. I'm like, oh, it's kind of cool. So the fox was, hunting, and I took this photograph. But you could see, in order for me to get that image of that fox in motion, it's 1/1600th of a second. So it's super quick, because also with a really long lens, this was a 300 millimeter lens, any little disturbance will also show up in the photograph. So I need to make sure that it's really quick in order to get it properly exposed and, pretty much motionless. And so the histogram on digital cameras, so both on a DSLR and on your phone, you will likely have some option to see this interface. It is a mathematical representation of the tonal range of a picture. And tonal range means, okay, on the far left side, this is going to be our darkest values. On this side, it's going to be our lightest values. In this case, we're seeing both the red, green, and blue channel and how it's the distribution of those channels and those values. Pretty much showcases the data you have in your image. Now, a different scenario, this one has a really slow shutter speed. And so you could see that with this drumstick, it's blurred. The rest of it's still kind of in focus, but because of that slow shutter speed, we can see motion at play in the image, because there's a longer duration of time in order to get a properly exposed image. So, aperture is an opening adjusted by overlapping plates called the aperture ring. This opening can be widened or narrowed to alter the amount of light that strikes the film or sensor. This is marked on your camera as f-stops or f numbers. Now, I'll admit, I'm not quite sure. I don't think that our phones have an actual mechanical aperture ring built into it. But there's going to be some sort of probably computer code that mimics what this mechanical element is doing. Now, one of the confusing things, at least this was kind of confusing when I first started with photography, is the lower the number for the aperture, so f2.8, Well, it's a larger opening, which lets in more light. Now, a high F number is going to be a tinier opening in the aperture ring, and it's going to let in less light. And you might be like, well, why would I ever want a high F number and have less light? I'll show you two different examples on why this could be beneficial. So, the larger the aperture, this will create a shallower depth of field. This will cause the subject to be in focus and the background to be out of focus. So, depending on if you're photographing like three-dimensional works, depending on the environment, you might not want all the texture for your backdrop. So you probably will want actually a larger opening for your aperture or a lower F number. So that way it's just primarily focused on this shallow space, and then everything either in front of it or behind it has been intentionally kind of blurred out. But this is being done in camera. So you can see right here with the histogram, it's f2.8. Due to the wide open aperture, the shutter speed was only 1 second in duration. Now, in the ISO, we'll talk about that in a few seconds. The ISO is going to be same between both of these examples. ISO still 100. The aperture has been set to 14. So it's a much smaller opening. What this now allows the camera to do is to get a greater range or depth within that field of view that's in focus. So you can see that all of these, corn cobs, at least comparatively, are now in focus. The problem with that smaller ring or opening, it drastically increased the duration of that shutter speed. We went from 1 second to 25 seconds. That's not possible unless you have a good tripod to keep it steady. And even just a little bit of movement within the space will kind of show up and add a little bit of chatter within the image. So last but not least, when it comes to these different parameters that affect the exposure, ISO is the measure of a photographic film's sensitivity to light, determined by sensitometry and measured on various numerical scales. It is also used to describe the relationship between exposure and output image lightness in digital cameras. So, yes, we see there's a technical difference between the two, between film and digital. But for our sake, it's more or less the same thing. A low ISO number requires more light to expose. And then a high ISO number will require less light to get a proper exposure. See, this is my only issue with this. I'm going to turn off the lights real quick because maybe this example will be easier for us to observe. A low ISO number, such as 100, will result in a reduced amount of grain or noise within an image. However, this rating requires more light, as I've already mentioned, to properly expose the image. So this looks pretty nice, and it may not translate as well on this screen when I go over to the next image. And this is more noticeable in the darker values, but we go over here. A high ISO rating requires less light, but will produce more grain or noise in the final image. It's still, there's a little bit of chatter here. When you see it maybe in isolation on your own screen with the PowerPoint presentation, you'll definitely notice that there's a significant difference. So typically, if you want to document artwork to the highest, degree possible, you want to use a low ISO number so that way that noise is not interfering with the information present in either the painting, the drawing, etc. So now we're going to go on to white balance and color balance. A camera setting that ensures neutral colors, especially white, appears accurate in photographs and video by adjusting the color temperature of the light source. This process helps remove unrealistic color casts, making whites look white and all other colors appear natural. Truthfully, on your phone, if this is going to be your primary device, it's going to be set to auto white balance, and it should, I would say 95% of the time, be a shoo-in. It'll do a really good job. Now, there might be instances where it's a little bit off, but that's where maybe the photo editing program that we have at our disposal will allow us to fine-tune it so that way it matches as faithfully to our actual original work. Now, if you are using a more manual camera, well, we do have a number of different options that are kind of inherently built in. So the example below demonstrates how the camera will compensate for the color temperature of a particular lighting scenario. For instance, photographing in the shade tends to be bluer. Therefore, the shade setting, white balancing option, will shift warmer to offset the natural color cast of the situation. So it's not absolutely necessary that you set the white balance on the camera, but it can be beneficial to get something more accurate. So this was all photographed in the same lighting condition, but with just different settings on the camera. So you can see under sunlight, well, it's maybe a little warm, shades really warm, fluorescent. Since fluorescent lights tend to be a little green, it's trying to compensate by making it a little bit bluer and a little bit, I guess, yeah, bluer and a little bit more violet, so on and so forth. Focal length. To minimize lens distortion, use anywhere from a 50 millimeter to a 200 millimeter. Although this can be corrected in Photoshop with lens distortion compensation filters, it is best to keep this at a minimum when documenting two-dimensional artwork to avoid compromising data. Because sometimes if you have a really wide angle, even on your phone, what's going to happen is maybe the verticals for your image will look slightly warped. That's not ideal. You want to try to make sure that when you're framing up your image, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, that the edges of either, the painting, the frame, are more or less flush or perpendicular or parallel to the actual frame within your camera. And focal length will allow us to kind of help out with that. Once again, we probably won't have as many controls if we're using our phone as a primary source, but it's still something to be mindful of. So some basic digital terms, those were all kind of geared towards more or less understanding the different properties of getting a good exposure down. So what we're actually creating whenever we take a photograph with a digital camera is we're making a bitmap or raster image. This is an image formed from rows of different colored pixels. And so if we zoom in on this little section of this digital photograph, you will see that it's comprised of this array, this matrix of all these colored squares. This is one of two different types of graphic, systems. The other one is vector-based. We're not talking about that today, but this is bitmap and raster, and that's what we're mainly focused on with the images we're going to be creating today. So now within bitmap files, we have a range of different options. Raw files contain uncompressed and unprocessed image data, allowing photographers to capture perfectly or practically every detail they see in their viewfinder. The raw file format stores the largest amount of detail out of any raster file type, which photographers can then edit, compress, and convert into other formats. Some common raw file types are CR2, that's Canon's. DNGs kind of a universal blanket. It's DNG actually stands for digital negative. These are pretty much the negatives or a negative equivalent in a digital context. So there's a lot of data here. Then NEF and then ARW. The app that I'll show in a little bit that I downloaded on my iPhone 7 will actually allow me to take take photos that will actually be saved into a raw format. So it gives me more flexibility when I edit those images. So most digital cameras can shoot both RAWs and JPEGs at the same time. We'll talk about JPEGs in just a moment. In this instance, you can see the difference in data or file size from the exact photograph and shot. So the pixel dimensions are the exact same. So just using kind of the preview on Mac Finder, you can see this exact same photograph. The shot time is both 6:57 p.m. and when it saves that shot, the raw file is 26.8 megabytes. There's a lot of information that's stored in there. The same exact image, even in a high resolution JPEG, has been already compressed down to 6.1 megabytes. So in order to still maintain the same amount of pixels within that image, it's essentially throwing out information. We want as much information if we're trying to create a really nice high resolution image that's accurate to what we're trying to depict. So HEIC is a compressed format developed by Apple that offers high quality images while taking up less storage space compared to other formats like JPEG. So if I use AirDrop from my phone to get some of these images from my camera on my phone to my computer, it's going to be an HEIC. These are also pretty nice. I think there's a little bit more flexibility with these than just a standard JPEG. Still a fairly small file size, but I have found that they're actually quite nice when I'm editing some images. JPEG is commonly used method of lossy compression for digital images, particularly for those images produced by digital photography. The degree of compression can be adjusted, allowing selectable trade-off between storage size and image quality. This is also a common output file from a digital camera. So, still 6.1 megabytes. What? Yeah, of course.
The HEIC. So if I share that photo with somebody else, they cannot on a different phone other than iPhone or a different device. Often people cannot.
They cannot view it.
Correct. Is there a way to change that on the iPhone, or do you have to export it and then export it out like out of Photoshop or?
Great question. So if I do AirDrop on my phone, it will preserve the HEIC format. If I email an image from my phone to someone, it automatically converts it into a JPEG.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Okay,
so yeah, so that would be maybe one way of going about it.
Thank you.
Great question. I'm sure there's another way to convert it directly before you try to email it to someone, but actually I haven't really done that. So now we're going to go to some comparative examples. So this is JPEG compression. Right now, they actually don't look too bad. So we have a high quality compression. This file size is 1.9 megabytes. The dimensions are the same between both of them. With the low quality compression, and when we save images and when we're in Photopea, it'll give us kind of a slider on, do you want high compression or low compression? And you can see how much this reduced the file size. At a distance, they kind of look the same. So depending on how this is being utilized, especially if it's going to be online and you need things to load up quick, low compression is probably what you want because it'll load quicker on whatever device.
So if you're doing an art portfolio of all your works, Is it best to have them all on that JPEG low compression?
Um, so like an online portfolio?
Yes, and it's sent on the computer.
A great question. I would probably, in that instance, I'd probably go middle of the road. I'd probably do it like in the mid point. Honestly, what I do for my website is I kind of limit the number of pixels for the size, but I do a really nice quality, so high quality compression, so it doesn't really remove data. It's maybe going to be a little bit slower, but I kind of want to preserve that quality over compressing it. That's maybe more of a personal preference, though.
Okay.
So at a distance, these don't look too bad, truthfully. But then the next slide, if we're zoomed in, you can see how, that same image, when it's zoomed in, you start to notice that it gets really weird and kind of distorted. And so this is what's known as kind of like a JPEG artifact. It's a result of the algorithm trying to remove data, but still kind of keep the essence of that original image. Kind of fascinating. It's above my understanding on how the coders have programmed that to actually work, but they did. So for web stuff, maybe low compression if it needs to be really quickly loaded. If we're doing a high quality print, you want as much detail there as possible, so we're going to keep it at high quality. Since JPEG file types are already compressed, meaning they have less information or data, they are not ideal as a starting point when editing images in a graphics program / software. In other words, you have less flexibility with your edits. JPEG should be reserved as a final deliverable for sending to others and submissions. Now, I understand if you are only using your phone, if you have JPEGs, that's what you have. That's fine. But I'll show you the difference in the next few slides on how a raw file that is uncompressed, that has all the data, gives us a lot more latitude if we do something wrong when we take that initial image. And I will apologize for this next slide because it's so dark up here, you probably don't think that there's any information or visuals there. So I took a photograph of one of my paintings. You can kind of see it. This was taken at the exact same time. So the .cr2 is the raw file. There's 21 megabytes of data. And then the JPEG, 2.8 megabytes. I intentionally underexposed this image. Now, with either Photopea or Photoshop or any photo editing program, what I can do is I can recover information, especially within the raw file, the .cr2. So on this next slide, I've recovered that information pretty much flawlessly. Maybe it could be tweaked a little bit. I wouldn't say flawlessly. However, with the JPEG, since some of that information was discarded initially, me doing roughly the same edits or even pushing it further, that just looks kind of dingy because it doesn't have information there that it can kind of extract and recover. So this is the downside of using JPEGs when you're trying to edit images. Going in the reverse direction, overexposed, same exact scenario. Now if I try to darken these after the fact, well, you can really see that because the brightest values were pretty much completely blown out in the JPEG, kind of knocking it down, now it feels too dark and kind of weird. It just doesn't feel right. Going back to the histogram, once again, we kind of talked that this is a visual representation of the information that exists within the image. So after I kind of edited that painting, brought down the exposure, you could see that in the example on the right here, between this and here, there's nothing there. It's completely clipped. So this is not a healthy histogram. With the raw file, you can see that there's still a bunch of nice data there. It's been, more or less perfectly preserved. And so you can kind of see the comparison between the accurate exposure. So this is one that I try to get it to the best of my ability directly in the camera, and comparing those two other edits. So last kind of example to compare. So using several $1,000 camera, comparison to an old iPhone 7. These actually don't look too bad at a distance. Now, when you zoom in, you'll notice that there's going to be some discrepancies. And I'll show a few more examples when we actually go through documenting things in a little bit. So 26 megabytes for the CR2 on the left and 2 megabytes for the iPhone on the right. At a distance, they actually look pretty good. But then once you start to zoom in, the way the iPhone, at least the older iPhone, tries to handle information, well, there's some algorithms at play that's trying to sharpen, find information, and make it look good. It's just, there's not that much information there. It kind of falls apart. Whereas with the DSLR, you can still see the weave of the actual canvas when I'm fully zoomed in. The colors still look pretty darn good though. So this one zoomed at 250%, the other one zoomed at 200%, just because there's more initial data with the dimensions of the CR2 versus the iPhone. So some additional things before we jump into actually taking some images. Framing, I've already kind of mentioned this in passing. It is critical that you square the edges or corners of your artwork within the viewfinder of your camera. The edges should be either parallel or perpendicular to the edge of your screen. In addition, you will want to leave a little bit of negative space around your work so you will have some flexibility when editing the images on the computer. So, very poor framing. Obviously, you can see how it's kind of skewed. Now, there's ways to kind of correct this after the fact in Photopea or Photoshop. The downside when you start to correct, like you're actually pulling that image, you're actually kind of degrading the quality of that image. So you want to do as little as possible, if preferably none at all. So typically when I'm going to set up a camera, I want to make sure that that lens seems like it's literally kind of at the same plane. It's kind of straight dead on as much as possible. So that way I'm not introducing any distortion. Yeah, it's not always going to be perfect. You'll try, but you do your best. So lighting, the most effective way to document your two-dimensional work, at least, once again, I'm less familiar with photographing artwork behind a glass, so I might not have as many suggestions in that instance. Polarizing filter for sure. So I guess keep that in mind with these suggestions. Is to have soft, evenly diffused daylight balanced light on your work. At least for painters, on a cloudy day, you can photograph your artwork almost anywhere outside. So this is me photographing this painting outside. The artwork is evenly lit under a cloudy sky. The camera's white balance setting was set to cloudy. The result is on the right. Also, as a note, I stood behind the painting to stabilize it from the wind. Kind of live out in the country, so it was a little shaky. Honestly, it's been a long time since I've done this in terms of photographing my work out under a cloudy sky. I think I'm going to change it to do that as my default, especially for my plein air paintings. I thought the color was the most accurate I had seen. So I was like, oh, I did that in undergrad for larger paintings, but I haven't done it in a while. So cloudy skies, excellent. Now, even if it is a sunny day, you can also take your artwork and put it in the shadow of a building. You will most likely have to do some color correction and post-production to compensate for the cool, typically bluish color cast that is created by the ambient blue light that filters into the shadows. So, honestly, this was also fine. Just taking a photograph of the painting, the camera's clearly in light, but as long as the painting is in the shadow, it'll actually kind of still do the same thing. It'll kind of filter the light. You can photograph artwork in the direct sun, but it's not ideal. For paintings with texture, avoid having the artwork lit from the side because the side lighting will emphasize the surface and potentially exaggerate texture or the glossiness and can be detrimental. I don't paint super thick with my work, so maybe it's not as much of an issue with me. Now, the one thing that clearly I don't like is that there's a cast shadow from the frame onto the painting, so that is not great either. Often, when I'm photographing in my studio or my room, I only have one single kind of light source. It's a really bright LED bulb. But in order to reduce glare, just hold a canvas over my painting and have a long exposure. What that does is it actually reduces the glossiness and almost acts like a cloudy scenario. It might not work in every single situation. When I was trying to do it kind of in this specific room, since I have a bunch of different lights and also the window light, wasn't as effective, so I guess it's going to be kind of dependent on the light source, which I guess all of this is. And as I've already mentioned, I'm using a spare canvas. The downside is if I do this, I have to use a tripod and a slow shutter speed if I'm using a DSLR. If you're using your phone, maybe have someone around, hold the canvas or the diffuser instead. So last little bit before we move on to the actual technical demo is just to kind of clarify the equipment that I often mainly use for documenting my work. I have a Manfrotto tripod. The camera that I am using today is a Canon 5D Mark II. I mean, this is still a nice camera, but I mean, I think it came out probably in 2010. So, I mean, it's 15 years old. So it's, by today's standards, it's out of date. The lens is a fairly nice lens. It's not a prime lens. A prime lens means that it is a fixed focal length. This is a 70 or 24 to 70, so there's a range of it. So it's a little bit diminished in terms of the sharpness of it. But it is a very nice lens. And then I primarily use Photoshop. Nice thing about working at IU is we have access to a really great suite of different software applications. However, as I've already kind of mentioned, not everyone has access to this information or those resources. We can still make really nice documentation with our cell phone. These things have gone a long way in a short amount of time and are starting to outphase those hunky devices. If you are really going to use this as your primary mode of documentation, I do recommend getting a tripod, small little one that's going to be specific for your mobile device, just so that way you have more versatility. You can at least maybe, put on a timer on your camera, so that way if you need to kind of reduce glare, you have the means to do so. I've already mentioned I'm using an iPhone 7, pretty darn old, still does the trick. The app that I will be using, or one of the apps on my phone, it's called the ProCamera app. Pretty generic sounding. I don't remember how much I paid for. I think it was just like $20, which is the most I've ever spent on any sort of app. I actually never really bought any apps.
30 now.
What?
30 now.
It's 30 now? Okay. The benefit of this particular application on my phone is it gives me the ability to control the ISO, even kind of the fictitious aperture, and the shutter speed, and I can save it as a raw file so that I get greater flexibility with editing my images. And then last but not least, we will be using Photopea.com. It's a little glitchy, it's not perfect, but since it's free and it pretty much does most of the same functions as Photoshop, it's kind of amazing that that's at our fingertips. We're gonna do real quick, I'm gonna plug in my computer. Or actually plug in the camera to the computer. I'm gonna go over to here. Turn off my camera. I didn't want the battery to die, so I turned some things off. Go up to here, tether. It's going to take a moment. What I'm going to do, though, in order to get the proper light on this painting, I found that I need all the lights on. So I've already kind of set this thing up. And let me do something real quick. I'm using this application just as a convenient way to demonstrating everything. So this is a live view of this camera. And I've already have it more or less kind of set up so it's nice and square. I'll take this down in just a few moments. We'll replace it with a different painting so that way we can go through and kind of fine tune some things. And I'll also photograph it with my phone. So with this specific painting, there is a decent amount of glare. And so I'm going to have to use something to kind of block some of the light that's coming from the side. I'm going to get out of this temporary preview. The nice thing about this application, this is also part of the Adobe Creative Suite, is I can actually take photographs on this camera by clicking buttons on my computer, which is kind of nice. And you can see at the top, let me just do this. It's telling me what are the settings on my camera. I have my shutter, my aperture, ISO, and auto white balance. The one thing that I don't like about this is it's not giving me an initial, like, is there a way for me to see like a temporary preview on what the exposure is going to be? So I just have to come over to the camera, and you won't be able to see it necessarily at the moment, but there's a little, I guess, diagram that shows kind of the sweet spot. You almost want the little notch to be in the center to kind of give an even exposure. The other thing I'll mention about this before I take an image is I have this set so that when I press the button, there's going to be a 10-second delay before it actually takes the image. That way, if I have a long shutter or if I need to, grab something to block the light, I have the time to do that. So I'm going to click and take this image, come over here. And what I noticed was there's a lot of light coming from right here and over here. Let's see. And I'm going to turn off the lights real quick so you can see. So there's a little bit of glare, but once again, we're not doing anything super fancy with like having complex lighting. So there is going to be a degree that it's not going to be perfect.
Hey Aaron,
Yeah.
would you be willing to do another one that without those light blockers to show the
Yeah.
comparison?
I can just, I'll get out of the way. It's a long delay, but so because it's a dark painting and I put kind of a high gloss varnish on it, probably not the smartest thing, there's a lot of glare on it. But you could see how, just trying to block the light with, yes, this is a diffuser, this is a reflector. I mean, most of the time I just use a spare canvas in my studio. So anything to kind of help block the light. And yeah, there's a little bit, but I don't think that that's too bad. Any other questions? I'm going to try something. Let's see what we can do real quick. I'm not just ignoring anyone by going on my phone. I'm going to mirror my phone. So that way, you guys all just saw my password to get my phone. Oh well. I'm going to turn the lights back on. I'm going to kind of see if we can come in here. And I know that we still have some glare on this. We'll take that image. And then I'm going to go to the ProCamera. And so you can kind of see, it's telling me at the top here, it's 1/30th of a second. The ISO is kind of shifting around. That's fine. And, I can kind of change the focus of this and the exposure. So right now, those red lines are kind of telling you, hey, it's too bright. It's going to be a little blown out, so there's not going to be data there. So I'm going to probably just put it in the sweet spot right at 0. Once again, I'm going to try to get this as square as possible within the frame. And I think that that's good. And so what I'm going to do is you can kind of see here, these are the images. Down in the lower left-hand corner, it's saying it's a JPEG. If I click on that, it actually gives me the option for the DNG. So then I could actually airdrop that DNG to my computer. And so I'm going to go back to this one. That's the standard one from the iPhone. And so we can kind of compare these different images. I think I took 2 that were DNGs, so I'm going to take this one as well. I'm going to stop mirroring. Let's go back. Get that out of the way. Now we got that image photographed, or that painting photographed. Let's just try one from scratch where we have to get it kind of squared up. And this, I'll admit, is going to be kind of tedious. See, I like to usually look at it from the side to see, does that still feel like it is on the same plane? Maybe let me turn off the lights real quick. At least the front one, so you can see the screen a little bit better. A little too close, so let me back it up. I think I'm losing a little bit of the bottom of, canvas or the frame. It's a little bit of a rotation to this. This is the nice thing about having a tripod that has kind of 3 points of movement, so I can swivel it and along, I guess, the main axis. I can tilt it so that it can rotate or it can pivot back and forth. This is Manfro, so this one's probably a little bit. This is my wife's, probably about a $250 tripod, so it's not cheap, but I do a lot of plein air painting, so I have kind of a portable setup when I go outside to paint. What I also use for my portable setup for plein air painting is this one right here. I'm gonna maybe get out of the live mode just so I can kind of see it real quick, just in the viewfinder itself. I think I need to move back just a little bit, and I need to bring this up slightly. And I don't think that that's too bad. I'm going to go back to live view. Just because the dark values on this screen aren't representing, or they're like too dark up here at the moment, so it's hard to see kind of the very edge of the actual painting. But I think that this is squared up at least decently at the moment. And I think it's fairly sharp because you can kind of see the texture. In some ways in this live preview, I think the texture looks almost a little too emphasized. When it actually takes the image, it kind of softens it slightly. So let's get out of that preview. I'm going to go back to turning on these lights. Let's see. Now, since this image it's the same lighting scenario, this isn't as glossy of a painting as the other one. It's also not as dark, so I honestly don't think I'm going to have to necessarily try to block the light with these dividers. It's also a smaller surface, so it's probably not going to be as problematic. So let's take an image. Actually looks a little, see, this is interesting. I didn't change any of the settings between that inherently darker painting versus this. So the luminance, or the amount of light within the room, stayed the same, but the exposure, I'd say, is way too bright. So what I'm going to do is I'm going for the shutter speed. I'm going to reduce it to maybe, let's go down 2 stops. So let's do that. Turn this back on. Now it does seem like there's a little bit of glare on it. So I could still try to mitigate that. So we'll try this one without, these blockers. All right, much better. I'm going to do one more with these, just to kind of ensure that if there is too much ambient light coming around, that it might knock things down. Now, since it is getting a little bit darker outside, because we're supposed to get some rain, it seemed like earlier the light that was coming from the windows was doing enough to kind of overpower. So that's why I was actually putting the blockers here, not up here. Kind of didn't expect that. But you just have to kind of play around given the environment and the situation that you're in. So I will turn off the lights real quick just so that we can see these.
And that's a diffuser and a deflector?
Yeah, it's just a diffuser.
Okay. I was going to say, you just hold them up just to keep light out and that's
Yeah.
it? Okay.
Yeah, just a little bit. And I would say that's not too bad. I mean, let's see, can I zoom? No? Let me. I'm using a wireless mouse I'm not as accustomed to. So zoomed in, that looks not too bad. Maybe that's just more or less when it's zoomed out, the texture is almost giving the illusion of a lot of glare, but I think that's actually fine. So I'll do some images with my phone real quick, and then we can jump into using Photopea.
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
Do you usually photograph your artwork with your frame?
Great question. I often do. I hand make all my frames, and so I feel like it's a part of the piece, but that's more of a personal preference. Now, when it comes to, I mean, I have in the past just photographed it outside of the frame, and that's fine as well. So, but the same, the same premise or methodology will still be applicable. So, any other questions? So let's go back to here. I'll move this out of the way. So we'll sync this up. That looks pretty square. And then I'll go back to here. So I'm going to compare both the purchased app, the ProCamera versus the standard built-in camera on the iPhone. The one thing that I have to do is in order for me to send the DNGs or the digital negatives, I have to go back into the ProCamera app in order to actually access that data. So I'll come back here. And I have to send these kind of individually. See, I thought I did this so I had more room on the bottom, but for some reason when it does the JPEG, it kind of crops it. I don't know why it does that. So when I clicked in the DNG, I have some negative space or breathing room around that image. And then let's go to this one. Okay. So what I'm going to do is all of these files that I took with my phone, as well as what I put on, took with the DSLR, I'm going to put them on the shared folder that we can all kind of use and potentially have at our disposal when we jump into the application. So I'm going to do that real quick. And if we need to get on computers, we could probably do that at the moment. And if you also need to take a quick break, maybe this would be a good time to do that while we get set up for the next stage of this exercise. So let me go here.
they have computers in there.
At 1 inch, and if they just smash those pixels together to give you that 300 DPI, because you know the computer's just going to interpolate it and it's just going to make up stuff to get you to 300 DPI.
So this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's a beneficial thing for us to explain. So this is the unedited image from the camera. And so I'm going to go up to image. I am using Photoshop just for convenience at the moment. We could still do the same thing in Photopea. I'm going to go to image size. And so this dialog box is showing us our our max dimensions, the 56 by 3700. Now at a 300 or 300 pixels per inch or DPI, it's going to give us an output that's 18.72 by 12.48.
Did it shoot at 300? Did you change it?
I did not change it. So what I'm going to do real quick is if I change this number to 72, the actual dimensions did not change in terms of what the program has to play around with. That 56 by 3700 is consistent. However, when I changed the resolution, it reinterpreted how it would essentially output that. So now it actually would be 78 inches by 52 inches. So in some ways, this camera doesn't really, it's not concerned if it's shooting in 300 DPI or 72 DPI. It's just going to always give you that maximum number at the top of 5600 by 3700. And then depending on how you're in a program, you can kind of adjust the interpretation of that data on how it's going to output it. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, but I guess my argument is when it shoots, it can only shoot, like if you're talking about an inch, square inch of painting, and if it's shooting at 72, it's only going to capture 72 DPI of that inch.
Yeah.
Yeah, but let's say you wanted it 300.
Yeah.
What it does is it'll say if there's a green and a kind of a green and a blue pixel, and it's got to make up 228 more pixels for that inch, it's just going to make up color. It's going to make up those pixels. It's not as good as if you scanned it, where the scanner is going to capture 300 pixels in that real pixels, real color, real texture, real what you really want. Because let's say you scan at 300, 8 by 10, and you send it to like Fine Art America, and they want to make canvas prints out of it. It's going to be much better than if you shot it 4 times as big, and then you asked it to come down to 300 DPI, and it's just making up that information in the.
So there's a subtle distinction that's at play.
Okay.
Right now, I'm not upsizing or downsizing the information that's present within the image. It's just, it is at 5600 by 3700 consistently. Now, and I've changed this from 300 to 72, but that number stays the same because the resolution, height, and width, those are all currently linked together. If I went to, let's put this back at 300, if I went to resample and I changed this, let's say we wanted it to be 600 DPI. You can now see that that changed our top number considerably. And so this is an instance where, because it's upscaling, the computer's trying to fill in that gap of information. That's not really what we want per se, but we're not really doing that at this point in time. I think we could still, I'm going to undo that, 300 DPI directly from this camera still is going to give us an 18 by 12 inch print.
So it must have like a high definition or something on there that you set, that is shooting at 300. It's shooting at 300, because when you brought it in,
It was just defaulted to that. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's got that setting on.
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Hopefully that helps answer your question.
I think the phone doesn't.
It might not. It might
It shoots
default.
at 72, doesn't it?
It might.
It might.
Let's try one thing real quick. Let's go back to maybe, I'm going to just do this image real quick. This is from the iPhone. So this is the .heic.
Oh, let's see what that comes in.
Open. And then I'm going to go here. So at least maybe it's the way I have my settings set on my Photoshop. This is still bringing it in at 300 DPI. And it's going to give me a slightly smaller print. It's going to give me a 13 by 10 inch image or output. Still not bad. So maybe it's based on how the computer is interpreting it. Doesn't really matter because the dimensions at the top stays consistent no matter if it's 300 or 72 depending on how the computer is interpreting it. All right. Let's go back to Photopea. So I'm going to go and, where did I put that? So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to open up one of these images. I gave everyone an option. So let me go back to, where is that drive? So the shared folder that was sent out in conjunction with this, like the signing up for this demonstration, I put the photographs I took today in photo or demo photo files. So there's like 6 images here. You can pick which one you want to use. I kind of don't really care, but the premise is ultimately going to be the same. The .cr2s are once again the RAWs from the Canon camera. The DNGs are going to be the RAWs from the iPhone, and the .heics are going to be just the images from this. I think, let's see if this will work. I'm not sure if I can just go to this folder and drag an image. See if that will work. Maybe not. You might have to download it, an image onto your computer or device in order to do that. Excuse me. I'm just going to go to open from computer. Let's go to studio session. And you can pick whatever image you want. The process is going to be roughly the same. Now, the one thing I will say is with the .cr2 and the .dng, it is going to ensure that we see a specific screen that we'll want. Let's see.
Can't get this going either. I love your brains.
So I'm going to go back. I'm going to open up the studio session 042.cr2. Does anyone else have any technical issues with opening up images?
I just can't get on my emails to get in me, so.
Oh, you can.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
I don't usually use this computer, so.
Okay. So, what I want to mention is this is odd. Photopea, as I've already mentioned, is a pretty nice program, but it's not perfect. So, this is trying to imitate Photoshop RAW, which allows you to kind of extract more information from your RAW files. However, the way Photopea kind of works is when it brings that image in, it looks horrid. And I don't know why. The data's still there. We could still make it work. But don't be alarmed that maybe the preview you saw and what you're seeing right now, there's going to be a disconnect. I just don't know why it does that. It's just about how it's interpreting it. So, on the right-hand side, we see our histogram at the top. You can clearly see that, well, at the moment, we don't really have any bright values. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to increase the exposure quite a bit. And then the contrast of this image also needs to be amplified. It's just kind of the way it is. So I'm going to brighten this up. We're getting a little bit of lighter values kind of on that edge. That looks a little bit better already. I'm going to increase the contrast. Now, I will mention that the way this projector kind of operates is it's already inherently a little more contrasty. So it might look actually pretty good at this state on this projector up here. It still needs a little bit to go on my end. So I'm going to still increase the contrast. Let's see, because obviously I don't want to make this so bright where the information on the interior in that lighter value range has just been blown out. So I've gone too far and I need to kind of inch it back. I'm going to zoom back in. There's some data there. And one of the other things that I'm doing, at least with Photopea, I can zoom in and zoom out. If you're on a Mac, I could do Command plus or Command minus in order to kind of zoom in and kind of navigate around. So this area still has detail in it. That's looking pretty good. I'm going to zoom back out. The dark values still seem like they could go a little bit darker. I'm going to see what happens if I increase the contrast slightly. Shadows and whites. In some ways, I just kind of play around with these slides to see, is it giving me the result that I'm after? One thing I should do, this is really important. Sorry, very bright lights. I'm turning off the lights because the screen's so hard to see in this, when all the lights are on. But whenever I'm trying to color correct and actually edit any documentation of my paintings, I'm always looking at the painting in the same light. So that way, I'm not trying to make my painting look better than it actually is. One of always my grievances is when I see maybe some painters that are adding more contrast or making it look better than it actually is, and then you see it in person, you're like, yeah. I think it's being somewhat deceptive. I guess I'm being a bit of a purist in that capacity. But there's also so many things at play where, is the monitor calibrated? Is your device calibrated? It might look great on one device and it might seem truthful, but then someone sees it on their computer and it might actually seem really exaggerated. So there's a lot of factors at play that you kind of don't have actual control over. You can do your best. And so usually when I'm editing an actual image, I'm also trying to look at the painting and kind of a normal lighting scenario so that way it reflects that work accurately. So I'm going to turn those back off. I'm going to maybe actually decrease the shadows. It's going to kind of darken not the darkest values, but kind of that range of values that's just above like pure black. That's looking a little bit better. Now, the other thing that we have that we'll kind of maybe focus on is we have color and tint. Now, the one thing that I don't like about Photopea's interface is, well, what's temperature and what's tint? How are we supposed to know what that really is? I'm going to take a little tangent real quick. I'm going to go over to Photoshop, and I'm going to open another image. Let's go to here, and let's go to Studio Session. I'm going to open up just a different image. So, in Photoshop, when you go to the same sort of interface, and you can already see that the color looks better already in the Photoshop. It's just the way it's interpreting the same data. It's nothing wrong with the actual exposure in the camera. It's just one, I guess, downside to Photopea. But on Photoshop's interface, when it comes to the color and it's showing you the temperature, don't want to knock that over. The temperature is clearly, oh, it's blue or it's really yellow. Or with the tint, it's either we can push it greener or a little bit more magenta. And I don't like that Photopea doesn't have that kind of visual reinforcement of what those sliders do, but it's in some ways kind of assuming you already have a sense of other photo editing programs to kind of inform your decision. So I'm going to go back over to Photopea somewhere. Right now, I think this looks too yellow. So I'm going to take this slider and shift it a little bit further to the left. I'm going to put it at 3600. Let's see what happens there. Kind of didn't seem like it changed anything. Let's just drag it to make sure that, okay, yeah, that's definitely going in the right direction. I went too far. It actually doesn't look too bad up there, but I'm going to edit this. Maybe I'm going to do it 3500, maybe 3400. Now, this might be still a little bright, truthfully. So I'm going to maybe decrease this to 1.2. That seems better. Maybe it's a little on the green side. And you're like, I don't see it. Over time, the more that you do photo editing, you'll start to develop a sensitivity on if an image feels either too yellow, too blue, or even too green or too magenta. And sometimes you start second guessing yourself. One moment it looks great, next moment you're like, oh, that's way too magenta. It's just part of the way it is. So let's see, add a little bit more magenta. It doesn't need much. I think I'm going to decrease the exposure. Now, the other thing that I will say, the last kind of set of sliders in Photopea that we're going to talk about is below color, temperature, and tint, we have vibrance and saturation. From my experience, Photopea tends to dull things initially, so I am going to add a little bit of vibrancy and even a bit of saturation. But just to kind of emphasize, saturation is for each given hue, so yellow, green, blue, etc. It's going to make those specific hues even more vibrant or colorful, for a lack of a better way of describing it. So if I bring this all the way up, it looks it looks a little too artificial, almost straight out of the tube kind of saturation. Well, that's not the way the painting is. It's gone too far in that direction. So I'm going to bring it back down. I honestly think maybe like 20 for this specific scenario seems a little bit more naturalistic. Maybe even a little less. You're like, well, what's the difference between saturation and vibrance? They're kind of interchangeable a lot of times when we just talk about artwork. The technical difference, at least on a photo editing program, is that vibrance will only adjust kind of the more neutral mixtures or colors within an image and amplify the saturation of those, but the already really saturated colors will just kind of stay in place and not be modified. So that's kind of the subtle difference between vibrance and saturation. Saturation, everything's going to just be amplified, where vibrance is a little bit more selective towards the more dull, less saturated colors, and will kind of accentuate those. Clarity, I'm not going to really touch texture or dehaze. Clarity, at least on Photopea, is kind of like sharpening. So if your image just feels a little bit soft, a little bit of clarity can kind of, I guess, resharpen it. I mean, I think it kind of is self-explanatory in terms of how it's been labeled. So I'm going to maybe add just like 10 for the sake of it. Questions about this stage of the process? Can I help anyone?
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
It might be a dumb one, but we have a camera where I work at, and it has a problem with focusing.
Okay.
Like there's some, like it's basically a Nikon, and there's like an adapter for it for like older lenses.
Okay.
So it doesn't have that like autofocus like feature.
Okay.
I've tried to take photographs before with it, and they just seem like okay.
Okay.
Like it's almost like tuned in. I didn't know if I just had to kind of like adjust myself, and then take the photograph and then sharpen it through this.
Okay. Great question.
Or the other way around.
Sharpening after the fact is never ideal, but sometimes it's what we have at our disposal. I don't know, I would have to take a look specifically at your camera to kind of diagnose it. Still a digital camera, right?
Yeah.
So one thing is, I want to see if there's a way for me to kind of showcase this. Let's do this real quick. I'm going to sync up my phone. This is going to be interesting. I'm going to try to film my digital camera. Maybe this won't work. A little too much glare. What I can maybe show you is there's a live view mode, at least on most digital cameras,
Okay.
that typically, and if you want to even come up here, what it will allow me to do is, even in the live view mode, I can zoom in and then I adjust this, where I'm focused at on my lens. So that way I can ensure that when I take that image, that it is as sharp as possible.
Okay, so you're actually just like zooming in on the display, not the actual
Yeah,
photo.
because I haven't even taken a photograph yet.
Okay.
So it might be in a different location. I'm not as familiar with Nikons, but at least, this is a fairly old digital camera. There's still live view mode, and you should have the opportunity to magnify in that live view mode to see if that plane that you're trying to focus on is as sharp as a tack as possible.
Okay.
And then
Yeah.
once you have that focus, then I take the image and usually I put it on a timer so that way there's no additional movement at play.
Right. Okay.
So I would try that out.
Awesome.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
All right. So going back to here, we're more or less done at this stage of the process with using Photopea's camera raw light parameters. We can click open. We're not going to talk about the difference between 8-bit and 16-bit for this. Honestly, it's not worth getting into, but 8-bit should be fine for us at the moment. Before we move on, does anyone have any other questions that I could answer? Yes.
I noticed that there was a difference between this software and the Photoshop in the surface texture look.
Yeah.
That the Photoshop seemed to be a little bit more natural as I look at your painting and then the image.
Yeah, I mean, Photoshop, you know, it costs money. It's been around for a long time. They've kind of perfected it. So I think we could still walk away with almost the exact same result. The way it's maybe interpreting what we're seeing on the screen up here just might be a little bit different between the two programs.
So the texture slider that you have in that program
Yeah.
really doesn't change things that much? Or?
So let's maybe zoom in and let's I guess adjust this. Let's see. It seems like right now it's
Resistant.
not wanting to respond. Let me maybe. All right. Huh. Let me maybe come over here. Go back over here. Yeah. Once again. Oh, texture. Now it finally moved up. Doesn't seem like it's changed the appearance of it. Yeah.
Interesting.
Let me go over to Photoshop real quick because I think it's going to be a little bit more responsive and we can kind of see the same ultimate effect. So right now texture's at 0. If I increase the texture all the way up, you can see that it's a little bit more amplified. Since I don't have that much texture in my paintings, it's not that critical. The problem is when you start really pushing these sliders all the way up, it starts to become something other than a faithful representation of the image. So kind of my personal philosophy is less is often more. You just want enough that it helps accentuate it, but it doesn't become overpowering. Does that help kind of explain?
Sure.
I'm going to click cancel out of that.
What was your settings on the Photopea at the top, the light? I know you. 155.
Yeah, 155, and I kind of adjusted the shadows a little bit.
And then negative 19. I'm just trying to figure out why I don't know what to do. It's a little slow.
And then after we've done that, I'm going to click open. Hopefully. Okay. What I did notice is when I was doing this workshop, a different type of workshop, when I was working with those grade school kids and they were all using Photopea, it seemed like if there was a lot of people using the same program on the internet at the same time, it started to run a little bit slower. So I think we'll be fine, but it might not be perfect. So some basics of this interface. We got a lot of information at our disposal. There's so much we can talk about, but we're going to put blinders on and only really talk about what's kind of essential for us today, because we would be here for a while. So what we have is on our right-hand side, we have the layers. This is probably one of the most fundamental elements of any digital photo or editing software. What will allow us to do is add different stacks or pieces of visual information using this panel. So I can pretty much add another image on top of the background and it'll be superimposed on top of the background image. And it's not limited on how many different layers we put in this area. So that's kind of awesome. What we're going to probably first do is if we need to do some fine tuning with the color, I typically do it at this stage before I start cropping or do anything else. So the raw interface gave us a lot of options. Sometimes it gave us enough and we don't need to do this next stage. But often I still find I need to kind of push it slightly. So what we have kind of at the very bottom of the layers panel is we have these different options. The one that's a half circle, it's kind of half filled in and half not, is called a new adjustment layer. What this will allow us to do is we can still fine tune the distribution of values, kind of adjusting the histogram, and then if we need to kind of even further tweak the color, we have another option at our disposal.
I have a question,
Yes.
and this is just hypothetical, or just an honest question. When you're doing, for example, a portfolio, and we're doing this,
Yeah.
is that being inauthentic by changing the color and everything?
Oh, great question.
I know, it sounds very ethical, but
No, I'm changing the color. For me, I'm changing the color
I mean slightly for tone
slightly to make it a more accurate representation
Okay.
of that. So that's my guiding premise when I'm trying to do photo editing. Now, other people will just want to make it look, better than it actually is.
Yeah.
I think, if you're trying to be a fine artist and you're trying to sell, your physical paintings or prints, and you're misrepresenting that work online or in a digital shop, well, I don't think that that's ethical, because I think someone's going to get that work and they're going to be like, oh, I thought it looked different.
Mm-hmm.
And then that kind of adds to maybe not a great representation of you as a practicing artist. Not saying that it was unethical, or maybe you just didn't have the skill sets to represent it faithfully. But yeah, that's kind of my personal opinion on it. But great question. So with adjustment layers, the benefit of this approach, this is what's known as a non-destructive editing technique or workflow. The benefit of this is we can always turn these adjustments on or off or adjust it at any time without any loss or degradation of the information there. So when I worked professionally doing kind of photo editing and this sort of work, my boss would be like, I need this adjusted. Well, this is going to be a way for me to always go back and apply the feedback later on without, compromising the original source image. So what we can do is, I'm going to go up to the top here. Each one of these, we have these lines that's kind of dividing. So brightness, contrast, and then down to exposure. All of those different options give us the ability to kind of adjust the distribution of light and dark within our image. They all kind of do roughly the same thing. I think it's a matter of preference. Truthfully, I like curves. I just think that it will allow me to kind of maybe push some of those dark values a little bit more while maintaining some of the lighter values with greater control. So if I click on curves, what's going to happen is I'm going to get another kind of panel or set of properties that I can adjust. So I'm going to click on this. And we can see, hey, there's that histogram again. Right now, though, the channel is all of the channels, so it's red, green, and blue. We haven't talked about RGB color space or anything of that sort, so we're not going to get into it. But when we're working on LEDs, we're working in light, so our primaries are red, green, and blue. And so that's what is being shown right here. We have most of our dark values right here, then our brightest brights. I think that kind of this area needs to get deepened just slightly. So if I click, it adds a node, and I can kind of bring this down. And so it's kind of darkening just this area, or the values that kind of exist in this region. I can add another node up here and push it up. I think that's obviously too blown out. I don't like it, but we can add as many nodes as we would like. Obviously, that's too dark. And we can get almost some wonky effects depending on what you're after. If we don't like that node, I think I can just click and drag and pull it away, and that will get rid of it. I just wanted this to be deepened slightly so that way it's more of an accurate reflection of the painting. The nice thing about this is I mentioned this is a non-destructive way of editing. So I could always, in the layers panel, you could see that it made, well, a curves layer. So everything that's below the curves layer is being affected by this adjustment or this set of parameters. And off to the side, we have an eyeball shape or an eyeball icon to preview the visibility of that layer. So I could click on that, turn that on and off, and I can even turn off that layer. If you see this checkered board pattern ever, what it means is there's no data here. It's just invisible. So there's no bitmap information or pixels that exist on that layer or within this document. So I think that those adjustments look good. The other thing I'm going to go and tweak is go back down to our new adjustment layer, and I'm going to go to color balance. The benefit of this, when it comes to color balance, is we have many of the same kind of sliders that we already had in the raw preview, but we also have the relationship between cyan and red. I don't know whether that's not part of the raw interface, not sure. But sometimes you will go through and adjust the magenta green ratio, yellow blue ratio in raw, bring it in, you're like, something still doesn't feel right. And maybe you might have to adjust the cyan and red. Now, the other thing that this specific step of the process gives us control over is, I won't say we're getting in the weeds, but you can see how quickly we can really get into adjusting this information. Right now, we're adjusting this distribution of cyan, red, magenta, green, yellow, blue, but just within the darker value ranges of our image. So we could check on the shadows, the midtones, and highlights and have a completely different set of options. Honestly, I think for the most part, the midtones is what I think needs maybe a slight adjustment. I think it needs maybe just a little bit more red. I could push this really green. Ugh, looks bad. I could also go back to the shadows, make this really yellow. And yeah, it looks not so good. If you go too far and you're like, I don't like this, you could either delete that whole layer, which we can click and drag, and there's a little almost waste basket down at the bottom of the layers panel. To undo that, I could do Command Z. That'll bring that back. One of the other nice things about Photopea is at the top here, by default, we have history. The history is every step that you've made or every adjustment you've implemented since you've opened up the program. Now, there might be a limitation if you've done 200 different things. It might cap out and it might not remember anything beyond that 200th modification. So just kind of be mindful of that. That's kind of dependent on the memory usage on your computer. I know that there's a parameter in Photoshop that you can adjust. I'm not so sure about Photopea, but I'm sure there's some sort of equivalent. So I could always go back to this stage of the process if I feel like I went too far. If you're like, oh, it's all right, I'll go back to here, and you can kind of jump around. But if I start modifying it, then it will kind of change again. I'm going to go back to this. I'm going to, at the bottom of the properties for that color balance channel, I don't like it, so I could just always reset that so that way I go back to the default. And I think just adding a little bit of red in the midtones is what I want. Questions? All right.
Thank you.
Of course.
Sorry, I have to leave.
The other thing that we can kind of do is if you still feel like you need a little bit more oomph, like the image was a little soft, and you still, the clarity didn't quite do the trick, we can always add some sharpening. Now, this is a personal preference, once again. If you need to add a bit of sharpening, I recommend doing one thing. I'm going to select on my background layer. You can click on each one of these and it gets slightly highlighted. If I click on background, I can right click and duplicate that layer, and it's going to put that duplicate above it. Because when I apply the sharpening, it becomes a permanent alteration. It's a permanent state. I can't undo it. So I like to duplicate that layer so that way when I apply that permanent state, if I decide later I don't like it, I can delete it and I still have my original image kind of at the base level of this document, just in case I need to go back and I have that flexibility. So I'm going to duplicate this layer. It's going to be a background copy, and I'm going to call this sharpening. You could just double click on the text and it should allow you to adjust the naming. Now I haven't applied sharpening yet. With this layer selected, I need to make sure that I'm selected on that layer. We could go over to filter up towards the top, click on this, and yes, once again, we have a lot of options at our disposal. We're just kind of focused on what we really need. And we'll go down to sharpen. Now we have a few different options at our disposal. This sounds kind of counterintuitive, but unsharpened mask is actually what you want to select. Don't know why, it's just a convention. Maybe it's like one of those things where it made sense at some point in time, but we've gotten so far away from that naming convention that it seems, disconnected. But unsharp mask, right now, ooh. So this is what it was before. The default really intensified it too much. At least to me, it looks over-processed, a little too, almost garish, for a lack of a better word. You're really just going to adjust probably the amount or the radius. Once again, I think less is more. The radius is probably too much. I might do 1.5. And then for the amount, I might do 125. Let's see. Okay, so that's it before. And it's just a little bit more. And honestly, I don't think this image actually needs it, but I'm just kind of showing if you feel like you brought in an image into Photoshop or Photopea, it needs a little bit of an accent. This is a way to kind of just push it a bit further.
What's the difference between amount and radius?
Great question, honestly. I think what happens with radius is it's almost taking a sample within a specific area, and then it's trying to define the edges within that radius, and it's trying to amplify that. So if it's tighter, if it's a smaller area, I think it's going to be more focused. That's kind of my basic understanding. I'm sure there's a more technical way of explaining it, but I just more or less play around with sliders and see what it does. So I'm going to click OK. Once again, that change, if I save this document, it's permanent. That's another important point. If I save this document, close out of it, and I bring it back up again, that history that we talked about has restarted. It no longer exists. It starts from the time you open up that document. So you don't have that option of going back after you've reopened up the document and saying, well, I don't like that unsharp mask. It's gone. So you don't have that, that flexibility at that state. So that's why duplicating that layer and making that adjustment. One other modification that we will do, I'm going to actually duplicate this again. So we can either right click on it, duplicate layer, or I can click on this, drag it down, not towards the trash bin, which is right here, but the one right next to it. It's a new layer. And so if I drag an existing layer of the new layer, that's another way of, copying it or duplicating it. And I'm going to call this one, I always call it cleaned. You're like, what? If I feel like there's something that is, maybe there's some dirt on the sensor, whether it's a DSLR, or maybe there's something on the painting, whether it's a hair or fiber, then I'm like, I didn't mean for that to be in there. Now it's all I can see. Well, we can go in and we can clean that little, artifact out pretty easily. So we haven't really talked about the tools on the left-hand side. There's a lot. What I am going to select is this Band-Aid looking like tool. It's called the spot healing brush. What this will allow us to do is anything that's kind of an anomaly, it will kind of detect it, it'll kind of get rid of it. But it feels seamless. So if I click on this, let's just say, there's kind of like a little shine right here. Not sure why. Don't like it. It's kind of, my old boss would say, it's tickling my eye. It's taking my attention away from my primary focus within this image. So it's not being deceptive. It's getting rid of something that is a distraction. So with the spot healing brush, if I zoom in here, and this may work, it may not work perfectly. What it's going to do is it's going to kind of sample this region based off of the size of this brush and kind of identify, hey, what's out of place here, and try to kind of figure out, all right, almost average it out and replace that anomaly. So if I click on it, it does a pretty good job. Now, I can, to a discerning eye, if you're zoomed in really far, you can kind of see, well, that weave seems offset strangely. No one's really going to look that closely at your digital image. So once again, with the spot healing brush tool, all I would have to do is on this anomaly, click, and it samples and gets rid of it. So a lot of times, anything that's like that, I'll kind of click around and kind of get rid of it. Let's see if there's anything else here. Honestly, in this case, image is pretty clean, to be completely honest. I haven't cleaned these sensors in a while, so depending on my aperture settings and that sort of stuff, if I'm doing documentation in the gallery, I have to clean those suckers up because there's a bunch of spots that's on my sensor or my lens. And so I'm using this tool constantly to clean up that space to make it look more presentable. But I would pretty much zoom around and look at the painting or whatever object and really clean it up. Which brings me to an interesting point. Bringing it back to the fundamentals. Just generally moving around the image. So zoom in, we kind of already did this in the raw preview, but I think it's beneficial to kind of clarify. I can do Command plus to zoom in. At least on my trackpad, I can just kind of scroll around so that way I can navigate around this interface and see everything without, too much effort. Because that allows me to be as precise as possible. So the last kind of stage of this cleaning up process is, well, we need to crop out that negative space. We don't want to put this image online with the background still in place. So the last thing we kind of would want to do is, I'm going to use the crop tool, or C. We can click on that. And I admittedly don't care for the crop tool as much in Photopea, but it's what we have. It's not like it's bad. I just feel like it feels clunkier, for lack of a better way of describing it. So if we did our diligence in trying to square up our image into our digital camera or on our phone, we can pretty much bring down these edges of the crop tool and it'll be completely flush with the edge of our, our canvas or our frame, whatever. We'll probably have to do some slight tweaking at the moment. So I'm going to zoom back out. I'm going to just bring this down as close as possible to the top edge. And I can already tell, I didn't do the best job at this. Because I can tell down at the bottom here, and I'm going to do something real quick, just so that it's more apparent for everyone here. I'm going to temporarily put a really obnoxiously bright adjustment layer. So that way you can see in these darker values down here how I thought I was really closely lined up, but I wasn't. That's fine. So let's go back to the crop function. See, this is what I don't like about the crop function on here. Like, that's not what I wanted. See? Go back to there. All right, there we go. So I'm going to bring this back up to about there. Bring this in. Zooming around. Have a little bit. I'm going to hit return real quick. Go back to here. Once again, it wasn't like when I extended this back out, it wasn't giving me this information back over here. Now, I would say, depending on your preference, you don't have to include the whole frame or even the whole image. If you feel like the stuff on the periphery is not as critical and you're fine with just cropping out a little bit of it, it'll save you some time and energy. That's fine. I'm a little obsessive and I want to be perfect in this regard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slightly tweak this image so that way it becomes flush. So I'm going to hit return. Return is what will kind of accept this crop at this current state. And I know it's too bright at the moment. I did that intentionally so that way we could see the bottom edge of the canvas or the bottom edge of the frame and what's behind it. What I'm going to do now is I could do it still on this same layer, the cleaned, or I could do it on a different layer, duplicate. I'll do a duplicate just for the sake of it. I'm going to do transform. What this will allow me to do is kind of just tuck those corners so that they're kind of perfectly flush with kind of the edge. In order to do that, I'm going to go up to Edit. I need to make sure that first, always double check which layer you're on. It's been many of times where I'm like, oh, accidentally deselected that layer. So I'm on Transform. I'm going to go up to Edit, go to Transform, and yes, once again, we have a lot of options at our disposal. You think perspective is what you want. In some instances, it may work. Actually, Distort will allow us to kind of independently drag each corner, kind of pulling it, so that way we can kind of get that edge so that it feels very either perpendicular or parallel to our digital frame. So we'll click on Distort. Now, the one thing I don't like about this is I have to zoom out in order to see what's known as the bounding box that exists around the original image. It's a minor inconvenience, but it is what it is. So what I could do is on these kind of white squares in this bounding box, if I click, I can now tweak this. Too much. I'm going to undo that. I'm going to go back to, I'm under Edit, not Image. Image has a different set of transforms that apply to the whole digital canvas. I'm under Edit, Transform, Distort, and all I want to do is kind of just subtly tuck this. Uh-oh, I'm getting the spinning wheel. All right, there we go. I'm going to just tuck this down. Let's see. Does it not? Didn't quite do what I wanted. I think it tweaked out a little bit. I feel like it's going slower. All right. All right, there we go. So I just click and drag, and now I'm getting that corner nice and flush. I'm going to come up here. And some of you that may be more digitally inclined are like, Aaron, this is a no-no. Yes and no. Because what I'm doing is by even subtly distorting it, stretching it slightly, I am ultimately compromising the information that initially exists within this image. Now, there's some purist out there that would say, absolutely, under no circumstances do you ever do that. You do everything perfectly within the frame of the camera and you never touch this sort of parameter. I think if we're doing just a little bit, it's not the end of the world. If we go too far, and I'll show you in a moment how this can become problematic, that we don't want to go too far and how it will really compromise it. But we really didn't do a whole lot, and I think that that's good. So I'll hit return, and return, or at the top here you have a check in order to confirm this adjustment to that layer. I'm going to turn off that brightness that I had at the top. And I would say that doesn't look half bad. Is it perfect? No, I'd probably tweak it a little bit more, but I think it would be sufficient for what I'm after. Let's go to, I'm going to duplicate this again, and let's just call this bad. And let's take this a step too far. So the downside when you start to distort a layer, I'm going to intentionally scale this down, hit return, and then scale it back up. And what we'll notice is how this affects the image quality. So let's scale this down. Now I'm going to scale it back up. That might be a little bit larger. Let's make it roughly the same as it was. And you can kind of see something at the moment. At the top here, it's saying, hey, you've scaled this up at 533%. You're like, well, we just started at 100%, scaled it down, and we're trying to go back up to its original size. When we scaled it down, it threw out that information of that original size. So it discarded a lot of data. If you try to scale it back up and hit enter, this is where we get into the area of, I mean, it doesn't look bad, but it's, when you scale it back up, the computer is trying to fill back in that data. It's upsampling, and it's trying to make up that difference. I'm going to turn off the bad layer so that way we can see how it compares to the initial transform. It's a pretty noticeable difference. So this is one of the downsides of bitmap imagery, comprised of a bunch of pixels. You almost have to set things up in a very methodical manner of trying to use what's known as a non-destructive editing technique, so that way you don't stumble into a situation where, why did I just encounter a lot of image loss? Because there's a lot that's happening right there. But with kind of the things we've talked about in terms of color balance, curves, transform, and making a bunch of different layers, if we always needed to, we could go back to our starting point without issue and then consistently remodify it later on. Questions? Do you have questions?
Maybe what you do is keep it big. Do all your fixing big.
Exactly.
The last thing you do is scale it.
Great point. Yes. When we go into, actually, I'll have to see what the options are on here. At least in Photoshop, when we save this as a deliverable, such as making a JPEG of it, we can then at that stage kind of determine the size or the amount of, like, the dimensions of that JPEG. And so that would be the time to downsize it, kind of not necessarily at this stage of the process. So I'm going to bring these all back, the good things. The nice thing about Photopea, it imitates Photoshop. It allows us to save our work as a Photoshop document. So if I wanted to, I can go up to File, Save as a PSD, which is a Photoshop document, And I'm going to do that. And this, if you wanted to go back in and work on these layers at a later point, you need to save it as a Photoshop document. No other file type is going to preserve. There's one caveat to that, but we won't get to that. We want to save it as a Photoshop document so that way we have that flexibility to go back into that image. So I'm going to just save this as Workshop Resources, and I'm going to call this Demonstration Edit. I'll click Save. And, 326 megabytes. That's a lot of information. But the good thing about that is it's preserving all that data so that way if we need to, we can go back and be flexible with it. Let's just do this real quick. Let's see, where is my... where did that window go? I must have collapsed it. Oops. Let's go to here. Studio Session. I'm actually going to bring that document that we just saved, I'm going to bring it up into Photoshop. Well, that was weird. It gave me a little warning there. I'm not sure why. Never really had that. But we can still see pretty much all that information is still there. It's still present in the same order that we had, which is pretty sweet. So it allows you that flexibility to go back and forth between those programs. I'm going to get back out of that and go back to here, wherever we had Photopea. So the last thing I wanted to kind of talk about, and then I'll have time for us to, maybe either play around or even answer some questions, is, all right, we saved it as a Photoshop document with all the layers. If we want to save this as a JPEG, which is typically, if you're going to upload this onto a website or anything of that sort, that's the file type that you want, is a JPEG. So we can go up to File, and let's go to Export As on Photopea. And you see we have a bunch of options there. Really, we're just going to focus on the .jpeg. It's going to bring up a dialog box that looks something like this. The format is JPEG. We can, change the name of this. Let's do demonstration photo. And you can see right here, this is where we have the option to change, the actual dimensions of that image. So instead of scaling it down initially as a layer, well, let's just change the output size of this so that maybe it's a little bit smaller. I don't know why I've defaulted to this, but at least for my website and a lot of high-res images that I put online, I'm not going to give them the full-res version. I know some artists are kind of paranoid. One of my old professors, he's like, I don't want high-res images of my work online. I don't want anyone to make prints of my paintings. I think that's a legitimate concern. So he intentionally made his images, I think, a little too small. But I don't put anything pretty much over 2400. I think, to me, that still gives a decent amount of data. But it's not so much that someone's going to, I would be flattered if someone's making prints off of my work and trying to sell it. I don't think that's going to happen. If I put the width at 2400 and I click out of this box, what it's going to do is it's automatically, at least fingers crossed it should, it will find the correct proportion for the height. So let's click off of this. So it automatically found the right dimensions for the height in terms of pixels and scaled it down proportionately so it doesn't look wonky. Because we have this it's a little illustration of almost a chain link. So that way those dimensions are always linked together to maintain the proportions of that image. Now we have quality. We already kind of talked about at the beginning of this demonstration. If we reduced the quality a lot, it's going to look kind of abysmal. Let's do one at 100. Just for the last moment of this, let's do high. We'll save that. I'll just put that there. I'm going to do another one. You can see that's 7.3 megabytes. And let's go back, export as JPEG. And same thing. Whoa. See, I don't think it's going to look that bad, but I don't know. Maybe Photopea's image processors maybe not as good as Photoshop's, because actually that's pretty extreme. I actually haven't seen that demonstration photo below. Maybe let's put that looks so bad. Let's do it at 15%. That might be a more realistic. And I'm going to go over and let's just look at those two images and compare them. So high, looks pretty good. We're zoomed in quite a bit. And then if we do this, so yeah, it's looks a little strange. It's not horrible, but that's not what we want. Like, obviously, if you're here today, you care about your artwork and your creative practice. And so you want to represent your, this is a love to do this. Sometimes the process of documenting our work, we're like, I love my work too much because this is so frustrating. I wish I hadn't had to document my own artwork. It can be really frustrating, especially if this is new to working in a digital manner. But these sorts of things that I've shown today will allow us to at least represent our work in a very faithful manner. Whether it's on Facebook, on our own personal website, or even if you're selling work on Etsy or something like that, or even just sending it to friends. I think that's it's really beneficial to have at least some basic understanding how we can kind of take our images from our phone and document our artwork in a fairly faithful manner. There's a lot of information I went through today. The benefit is I did record this whole thing, so that way I will put it on that shared folder, so that way if you want to watch it at a later date, you can always do that. In addition, if you ever have questions about, I might not be able to answer every question, but at least about Photopea or documenting your work, you can send me an email and be more than happy to try to respond. Might not be responding as quickly as possible, but, I'd like to help. So does anyone have any questions, anything that I could answer at the moment? Yes,
You
Carrie.
said you're going to put the video on
Mhm.
shared drive. Are you going to take that down at any point?
No.
So it's permanently out there?
Permanently out there.
Well, that's great. So hang on to the link.
Yeah. And the PowerPoint presentation that I did today is also just on there, as well as both as a PowerPoint file type, and then also I saved it as a PDF. The other thing I'll mention, let's see, where is that? Sometimes I feel like, all right, here we go. So those were the images I took today, demo photo files. Example files are all the ones that I kind of made for the PowerPoint presentation. So if you even wanted to take some of these images and play around with them later on how like the intentionally underexposed image, how is that going to actually work on Photopea or on your computer, you have the option to kind of explore, the capabilities of, editing that kind of file type and that initial information, because I wanted to give those resources to everyone. So there's a lot of, some of those files are fairly large, so it might take a little bit. Any other questions? Now, with the, there wasn't an exact cutoff time. If you want to stick around and play around with Photopea and editing some images, I'd be more than happy to assist. If you're like, I have too much information and it's late on a Friday, I just want to go home, that's fine as well. So I'll leave it up to you. Yes?
Yeah, I do have one question that might be helpful for everybody. So I'm in the quilting space and I take minis with me to travel, and sometimes they end up with snow. So I know the whole white balance, all that kind of stuff, but a lot of times you still end up with gray snow. So how do you best work with whites in editing? Because if you use exposure, it can blow it out.
Yeah.
If you use whites, it kind of brings everything up. So do you have any helpful hints?
About like photographing?
Yeah, no, photographing, but editing it, right? Because again, still struggling a bit with, you take those steps up, down, whichever way you put it. But when you get back, it's still gray for the most part, right? You have to go in and tweak it just a little bit. Is it just, you just gotta find it? I struggle with finding the white with exposure and white, so you kind of need to do both, but I didn't know if there was a better way besides just doing a better job getting it on the camera.
Honestly, it's a great question. I don't know if I have a very
That's
clear
fair.
answer.
That's fair.
I would probably have to see a specific image in mind to see, okay, what's either an image or even a scenario that I could probably analyze and provide on more like, okay, in this situation, I would do this. Obviously, when it comes to if you are photographing a snow scene and the sun is out, it's just blinding light. So that's going to almost artificially, I guess, influence how the light meter is reading. It's going to think it's way brighter than it actually is. Now, some people, and I don't know if this would be an instance where this would be a good approach, is you can always create like a custom white balance on either the camera. There's a few different ways of doing this. With this specific camera, I can actually adjust, there's almost like a 4-quadrant grid between like green and magenta and then yellow and blue, and I can almost kind of adjust it so that way it kind of compensates in this direction for that. So I kind of do that actually in my studio. I don't know if that would be a scenario where that would be appropriate. Other thing is I didn't bring this here, but my wife has a gray card.
Oh,
and so
I have them, I just don't carry them with me. Never thought of carrying it with me. Duh.
What that would do is a gray card is you can take a photo of it. It'll take it should cover the majority of the frame when you take this initial test shot. And what it will do is with this gray card, it will kind of interpret the color temperature within the space and then kind of calibrate the color balance for that specific scene. I don't know if that's going to be...
That's an idea.
That would probably, between that and probably testing around with exposure and shooting in RAW should give you the flexibility and the precision to get what you want. That would be my assumption.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions?
I have a question
Yeah, of
about
course.
the file types. We're just talking about Photoshop, DSD, and JPEG. There used to be a recommendation of saving TIFF files.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Does that still hold?
Yes. So let's maybe go back to Photoshop. Let me maybe open up this demonstration edit. Let's see. We'll save as, and we'll save this as a TIFF.
What is a TIFF file?
It's an uncompressed file. So in some ways, like a raw image, it contains all the data. Now, Actually, let me redo this real quick. I'm going to save no, not save as. See, I'm going to save as a copy as a TIFF. The other thing about a TIFF, in this case, it has layers checked at the bottom. So a TIFF is another way of almost saving all the same data as a Photoshop document. The downside to TIFF is not quality, it's the file size. So really, TIFFs are predominantly only used if you're sending it to someone, you're sending them a high-res image that they're going to eventually use for a print publication because it contains the most information possible. So let's just quickly, I'm going to click off layers, save this as a TIFF. No compression, all this other stuff, we just leave it as is. And I want to show you the file size of that TIFF. So we saved the JPEG, that's 7.6 megabytes. This TIFF of the same image is going to be 33.5 megabytes. So it's noticeably larger. It's not unreasonable by any means. Actually, that's kind of better than I thought. But depending on how large of the size, it's going to exponentially increase. And so then it sometimes becomes, more difficult to manage. But it's like, it is the gold standard. It's kind of like a raw equivalent. It doesn't distort the data there. So, excellent question.
So it's a good thing to store it.
Good thing to store it, yeah. Not necessarily the best thing to use if you're going to be putting it on Facebook or you're putting it on your website, just because it takes a long time to load, and so it's not desirable in that manner. Honestly, I don't really save TIFFs that much unless I am sending something to a printer, because if I need something that size, I just leave it as the PSD file, truthfully. That will be kind of my container, and then if I need to send it to someone, I'll just use a JPEG. But excellent question. Any other questions?